It's really an extraordinary time in history for several reasons. One, the U.S.'s relationship with Europe is changing. It's a change that's been underway for a long time. The U.S. has warned Europe, really going back as far as the Eisenhower administration, that they expected Europe to step up and be more of a leader in Europe, to spend more on their own defense. And finally, you have a president who said enough is enough. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, history will decide. But for now, the relationship with Europe is strained to the point of almost breaking. And the U.S. has gone on a unilateral discussion with Russia to determine the fate of Ukraine. Obviously, this makes Europe quite uncomfortable, as it makes Ukraine just as uncomfortable, because they see that the U.S. has not invited them to the negotiations, and they see that the U.S. may be determining their fate. And that fate right now seems to be a choice between bad and worse. The worst would be where the U.S. basically gives in to any demands that Russians have in order to improve the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, which seems to be a key tenet of the Trump administration. The bad would be that the U.S. came to some sort of an agreement where the Ukrainians would in turn give some sort of assurance that the U.S. could access critical minerals within Ukraine, which would give a footprint of sorts, not a military footprint, but a footprint of sorts of the U.S. in Ukraine, which you would think would be a deterrent to the Russians. The best the Ukrainians can expect at this point is to maintain about 80% of their pre-war territory. So that the Russians will take what they have now. There will be some other guarantees, no doubt, that the U.S. will not allow Ukraine to join NATO, and who knows what else the Russians will be able to negotiate from the U.S. So in many ways, the U.S. is brushing NATO aside, brushing Europe aside, saying we've had enough of this.
Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I don't know what's the problem, but he hasn't been able.
Russia and Ukraine are like two punch-drunk fighters in the 8th round of a prize fight. They're both standing, they're both still throwing punches, but they're flat-footed, they're staggered. Both have bled terribly, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Neither has the manpower to be able to continue the war in the way that it has for years to come. So there are some advantages. The Ukrainians have been using drones to great advantage. They have the ability to make hundreds of thousands of drones a year, which could be effective in their defense. But the Russians eventually, with their economy and the population 4 times Ukrainians have, will eventually overcome just by force of industry and force of numbers. So the Ukrainians are a bit desperate here because they know without U.S. support, without U.S. military support, that their future is limited, which is why they probably feel quite vulnerable, knowing that the Europeans are not going to step in and do the kinds of things that the U.S. has been doing, so that the Ukrainians will be able to create some sort of a negotiated peace on more favorable terms.